Thank you very, very much, David, and good morning to our esteemed panelists. I also want to welcome all of those who have joined us via YouTube and various media for what I think will be a very stimulating discussion. The global tourism industry has proven to be remarkably resilient. Somehow it has been able to bounce back from landmark shocks like the 9/11. We had the 2008 financial crisis, and the general expectation is that it will bounce back again from the current COVID-19 crisis, although there are varying projections as to when this will happen. But what is clear is that recovery in source markets as well as in destinations will depend on the efficiency of vaccination programs as well as on the efficacy of the vaccines themselves. But as our panelists, I think, would likely posit, the biggest threat to tourism is the absence of sustainability or the need for sustainability. So for the purposes of this discussion, therefore, we will assume that the industry will bounce back. But what type of industry will return? What type of tourism will return? Will it be business as usual tourism with all of the negative features that we are familiar with? Or will it be a redefined or more refined tourism that is truly sustainable? And by sustainable, I mean one that renews and does not deplete the natural capital on which it depends for its survival, one that distributes its benefits more equitably to citizens in host countries. Will it be that type of tourism? These are all relevant questions. And if we accept that it is nature that attracts tourists to many destinations, defining and measuring nature-based tourism is going to be critical. And how do we achieve that? Today's discussion will attempt to establish the factual contours for a better understanding of nature-based tourism and how it may be practiced in a sustainable manner. And as you heard from David, the discussion is part of a Global Environment Facility funded project that is just about to get on the way in 4 islands in the Eastern Caribbean. We have a really stellar group of panelists here, and our first speaker today is an old friend, former Deputy Director of the St. Lucia Tourist Board in St. Lucia, and she's now the tourism specialist at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States based in St. Lucia. I'm speaking about Maria Fowle. Maria, we're looking forward to your perspective on the challenges and opportunities that you see from your unique perch up on the hill at Mount Fortune. We look forward to your presentation now. You now have the floor. Maria? Maria, are you there?
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody.
Good to hear you.
Yes, I am. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Cletus. Yes, definitely old friends. So I'm gonna just share my brief presentation this morning. Promise to try and keep to the time. Is everybody seeing my screen? In presentation mode?
I see it.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, so to get right into it, let's look first of all at the definition of sustainable tourism. We look at the World Tourism Organization's definition that a tourism that takes into full account of its current and future economic, social, and environmental impacts, addressing the needs of visitors, the industry, and the environment, and the host communities. So we have the 3 pillars, environment, social, and economic. The sustainable tourism guidelines and management practices are really applicable to all forms of tourism, in all types of destinations, and perhaps maybe sometimes that is misunderstood. It speaks to a balance between the three pillars: social, environment, and economic. And it is not the same thing as ecotourism. Ecotourism is a form of sustainable tourism, but it's not one and the same. So the benefits of sustainable tourism is to the traveler, to the tourism service provider, and to the host community. Let's look at traditional tourism versus sustainable tourism. Traditional tourism targets large numbers. There's a lack of stakeholder involvement. There's an absence of long-term planning. There's no enforced regulatory framework. Sustainable tourism, on the other hand, is a viable long-term strategy for success. It uses the regulatory frameworks. It creates linkages to other economic sectors. The products are tailored to the market, and there's a sense of ownership, culture, and pride. Within the OECS, in terms of an OECS vision for tourism, we put into context the OECS mandate is to consolidate the single economic space for enhanced economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. So within that context of the OECS mandate, the overall aim of the tourism policy is to achieve balanced growth through tourism. And the vision for the OECS tourism is a tourism industry that is viable, internationally competitive, resilient, and sustainable via collaboration and synergies, whilst improving the quality of life of its citizens. So I therefore put forward that if the growth and development of the OECS tourism sector is not improving the quality of lives of our citizens, then we need to rethink it. Some examples of good practices for sustainable tourism within the OECS and some of the countries that we're focusing on for this program. Dominica, the Nature Isle, tourism is built around this brand promise. You're going to hear a little bit more from Colin later on. St. Lucia has looked at a model of St. Lucia Village tourism, which has maybe born out of the heritage tours and heritage tourism program, but it's a model that perhaps Carolyn might speak to later on. Antigua and Barbuda, there are a number of historic and heritage sites, Shirley Heights, Nelson Dockyard, that a lot of work has gone into making these sustainable tourism products. In Grenada, there are a number of examples. The one that I enjoy most is the underwater sculpture park. And so, that looks at the blue economy side of sustainable tourism. So the OECS has a competitive advantage in several tourism niche markets: adventure, nature, heritage, and culture tourism. Pursuing these niche markets can support the management of protected areas and other conservation efforts. So we know that COVID was an unprecedented crisis for the tourism sector. The industry came to a hard stop, hotels closed, persons were laid off, borders were closed, and it really took crisis management to a completely different level. Moving beyond COVID-19, we have an opportunity to transform tourism, a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable tourism. We need to walk the sustainability talk. Policymakers must set the agenda for the new tourism model. So in restarting the tourism after COVID, the OECS partnered with other regional institutions. We recognized that health was the priority. We needed to open safely. We established protocols. So there are protocols that we worked on with the COVID-19 task force of the Caribbean Tourism COVID-19 task force, which would have been CTO, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, Hotel and Tourism Association, CARFA, etc. The OECS Commission also made recommendations to the heads of government on the reopening of borders, and that was done jointly between tourism and health. There are a number of resource materials that one can look at. I don't have all the time this morning, but certainly if there's one document that perhaps you can would be an interesting read, would be the UN's document on the policy brief on COVID-19 and transforming tourism. There were a number of key points that were made towards the roadmap for inclusive, more inclusive and sustainable tourism sector. And these documents are also all available. UNWTO put out some documents as well in terms of priorities. We have the One Planet Vision, and there are also some work that have been done previously. So sustainable tourism, what's the policy intervention that we're looking for? We need to be clear on what type of tourism we want. We need to set a framework for tourism development, tourism master plans, national tourism policies, etc. Implement those plans. It's not good enough to prepare those plans and have those plans sitting on a shelf. We need the shared responsibility of all stakeholders in the implementation. But the policymakers need to lead if we are looking for that desired balance. So we need to support tourism SMEs. We need to facilitate community tourism. We need to create linkages to other economic sectors. We need to protect the natural resources, which are what gives us our competitive advantage. We need to recognize the importance of data more than just visitor arrivals. We need to commit to tourism satellite accounts and measuring sustainable tourism. We need to develop partnerships with NGOs, universities, and other like-minded organizations. So in closing, sustainable tourism, I picked out this quote from George Washington University. If practiced responsibly, tourism can be the engine for innovation, drive sustainable consumption and production, generate revenue and incentivize communities to protect their valuable natural and cultural resources. And with that, I thank you. Cletus, back to you.
Excellent, Maria. Thank you very, very much. You did not disappoint. So much information that you shared with us, and your perspective is quite rich. There was one point that you made that I think is something that we might want to keep in our minds as the discussion ensues. And that point is, you said very, very clearly, if tourism is not improving the quality of life of the citizens of a destination, then it needs a serious rethink. And those policy interventions that you gave towards the end are most apt. And again, I think they provide us with a solid foundation for the discussion to follow. Thanks very much for that. So our next speaker is another good friend. I'm blessed in a way to be able to say that all of the panelists today are my good friends, and I hope they continue to be. Carolyn Trubiscoy has been a friend of long standing. She has been a stalwart and in many senses a leading light in the tourism industry in St. Lucia. Carolyn has moved between the local Hotel and Tourism Association and the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, which she has led in intervening periods. She's now back as president of the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association, but she's equally well known as executive director of Anshasne and Jade Mountain Resorts, two of the best known hotels in the region that have repeatedly and consistently attained awards globally. So Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much for the introduction, Cletus. Let me do my screen share. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. And you can hear me, great. So great introduction. Thank you, Cletus. Just to say that this is my fourth term as president of the St. Lucia Hospitality and Tourism Association. I had the pleasure of serving as president of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association for 2 years. And I'm also the envoy of what is called the Caribbean Challenge Initiative. I will speak to that a little bit more. And also I am, since last July, the chairperson of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund. So I'd like to make myself available for a lot of volunteer leadership positions because I'm passionate about not just the hotel industry, but our environment and where we're going with all of this. The St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association does not just represent hotels. As a matter of fact, the majority of our members are allied members that are small and medium locally owned enterprises, very dependent on a successful tourism activity in the country. We know that tourism is, the Caribbean is probably the most tourism dependent region in the world. And St. Lucia in particular is actually among the top 6 countries in the Caribbean where tourism supports more than 25% of the economy. As Maria had already said, what we have been missing for many years is good tourism satellite accounting to really highlight how tourism activity trickles down into other economic sectors. And I think we all know how many sectors benefit from a successful tourism industry. Prior to COVID, the tourism industry was, I mean, I would say, I wouldn't say used, but we were used in a way to get regular blows, whether it was dengue fever that affected visitor arrivals, sargassum, Zika, which is also a mosquito-borne disease, floods and hurricanes. So some of the major events in the last 21 years would have been, of course, the terror attack, September 11, but also the economic crisis, 2007, 2008. But then when you look at the last few years, it all has come from nature and environment. And that should already make us pay attention. COVID itself, unprecedented because it just didn't affect one source market, but the whole world. And basically it made the Caribbean tourism plunge by over 67% in 2020. We had 31 million stayover visitors in 2019 for the Caribbean and over 30 million cruise visitors. When we now go to St. Lucia pre-COVID, we had over 400,000 stayover visitors and over 780,000 cruise visitors in 2019. And then basically, we had about 91,000 visitors till March 2020. Then from when we reopened in July and until the ending of 2020 and into 2021, we have only had 45,000 visitors. So when you look at January, we had 6,000 arrivals in January. It was 33,000 in 2020. So huge effect on tourism. When you look at the latest forecast, there was some sort of, I mean, a little bit of optimism at the beginning of 2021, but we realize really we're looking at a very slow recovery. Whether you look at the latest statement by the IMF or UNWTO, in essence, we agree that recovery will not really take place fully till 2023, 2024. So tourism and sustainability. When we go back 20, 25 years, I would say you all remember that a lot of hotels began by thinking the towel card was their contribution to being green, like the towel card where it said, use your towel more than once and conserve water. But we've come a long way. And of course, hotels over the last 10 years at least took sustainability much more seriously. And there have been some exemplary operations that showcased what you can do with your operations. The 2017 hurricanes, and of course, I was very much involved in this from a Caribbean perspective because I was president of the CHD at that time, also taught us the importance of going beyond sustainability and trying to create a much higher resilience. And now going to the future, I would say we need to take it another step forward and now look at having responsible tourism destinations and also cater to what I call the responsible traveler of the future. When it comes to vision for tourism, I think we all know what the vision is. And I mean, it was very nicely expressed by the UNWTO. If I just quote here quickly, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, tourism can be a force for good in our world, playing a part in protecting our planet and its biodiversity and celebrating what makes us human, from discovering new places and cultures to connecting with new people and experiences. So the vision, I think we know what that should be, but how do we now make that vision a reality? And I think this is the challenge. Now, when it comes to the coastal and marine environment, tourism is very dependent on having a very healthy marine and coastal environment. And of course, our marine environment is not just affected by climate change, but also by our issue with plastic pollution, to just name a few. Now, the vision that is currently being created and coming also out of the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, which is one of the Caribbean Challenge Initiative was one of the first initiatives that was Caribbean-centric to advocate for protection of at least 20% of the marine and coastal environments in the Caribbean. And now we're taking it to 2030, and we want to see that at least 30% of the world's ocean and also in the Caribbean are safeguarded and protected. Now, when you take this down to the ground, and when we're talking about St. Lucia, we have what we call here the Soufrière Marine Management Authority. But again, when we really study the Soufrière Marine Management Authority, it needs to be strengthened, and there has to be a very strong public-private sector collaboration to really ensure that we can save our environment, strengthen it, preserve it, and safeguard it for future generations. When we look at the operational side of tourism, I call them the big ticket items that require public sector collaboration as well. It's the whole issue of being energy efficient and having more renewable energy integrated into our grids. The whole issue of wastewater management, freshwater management, the recreational water quality. These are all things that usually require also public sector input. It cannot just be solved by the private sector alone. On the plastic reduction side, I would like to see that we go back where we started before COVID. COVID, in a way, has really made us go backwards, because now we go back to using a lot more plastic than we used to. And then when we look at waste recycling and that, there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that our solid waste management authority is actually able to deal with all the waste that we produce. We might separate it at our operations, but it will still be thrown all together in a landfill. So lots of work ahead. The carbon offsets reduce our contribution to greenhouse gases. I put it in there, but we all know that the Caribbean is not really a huge contributor. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of our contribution. The challenges, to some extent, are legislative restrictions. For example, in St. Lucia, the commercial limit is 25 kilowatt of renewable energy that we could integrate in the grid. There might be technical restrictions. I often find that our political election cycle in the Caribbean and elsewhere, of course, but in the Caribbean, this may also affect the continuity of progress and process. I refer to, ministries being changed every 4 or 5 years. And when it comes to going forward with sustainability, we have to be able to work with a consistent body that can drive this forward. We cannot reinvent ourselves every 4 or 5 years. There's also great duplication of effort. If you start Googling yourself, you will see there is so many marine preservation organizations, sustainability institutions, but we have to try and bring all of these efforts together, compare notes, and strengthen the entire initiative going forward. So I'm looking for streamlining of initiatives. I'm also looking for more accessible funding mechanisms for the private sector. You'll be surprised how difficult it is to actually get additional funding. It sounds as if it's available, but when you try and get it, it's actually not. And clearly coming out of COVID, I would like to argue that we are, as an industry, in survival mode. So we want to be sustainable, but have we got the capital asset to actually drive it forward, or do we need help? Now, what do we want to see in community participation? Maria has already spoken to it. We want to see buying more local, whether it is, strengthening our linkages with agriculture and manufacturing. We want to promote local. So we have our small and medium enterprises. A lot is being said about vertical integration in tourism, but the way to get around this is important, and I will talk to it a little bit more. We want to celebrate local. We want to celebrate culture, arts, and music. But first of all, our own people have to appreciate what we got, appreciate our own culture, and from that, then also make it part of the tourism product. I love what has happened in the Maldives by Sunay Vafushi. They have developed.
I think he has graduated from that over the years. But Damien was a very powerful Minister of Health and Wellness and Human Services in St. Lucia. He also had Family Affairs and General Relations as part of his portfolio. He is a noted Calypsonian, and so he has taken his message to Calypso, and has been very effective at that. He's now with the St. George's University in Grenada. And so against that background, you can understand why we're delighted to have Dr. Damien Greaves with us. Over to you, Dr. Greaves. You have 10 minutes.
I think you're on mute, Damien.
On mute. Right. So hello to everybody. Thank you very much, Cletus. For a moment, I didn't know myself there when you spoke about me. But thank you very much for the accolades that you gave. And let's get into the heart of the matter. I want to see this as a rather momentous occasion to, in some form, speak truth to power. Because sometimes we have to cut to the chase and say it like it is. So my responsibility is to look at the health considerations and opportunities for reopening a sustainable tourism. And every now and then I'll be looking at Grenada, because I think Grenada presents a situation that may not be considered best practices, but certainly good practices, and considerably good practices at that. And so I would like to inject every now and then the Grenada experience. So basically what we are saying is that we have to understand that this is how my tone is going to be set for this presentation. We have mortgaged the health of our future generations to realize economic gains and development. And that is coming from a distinguished lecturer, Dr. Sanjit Maharaj at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, in a presentation that he made on planetary health. And this really piqued my interest when he mentioned it. But so ultimately, the goal is human security. Ultimately, that's what it is. And the great Sir George Allen, we all know him in the Caribbean, suggested, and I quote, health security is one of the instruments and pathways to achieving human security. And didn't the COVID-19 contagion force us to have a dual focus on health and tourism, and of course, ultimately economics? So let's deal with pandemics and tourism. We have reached a stage where our island paradises can become disease incubators without proper controls. So tourism can directly contribute to pandemics. In fact, it has directly contributed to pandemics in terms of food waste, habitat interference, etc., something that you can read there. And there's a frequency and scale of travel which accelerates into the international spread. And we have to keep that in mind. COVID-19 has also brought to our attention the interactions of travelers, whether they become victim sentinels, couriers, or even transmitters of what we call microbial pathogens. So what have we learned from history? Speakers before me suggested that tourism has shown a resilience. It has rebounded from disasters, from pandemics and epidemics. Cletus also spoke to us about that. But we are saying that the pandemics have been increasing since the 1980s. And could the next one be deadlier? Are we in fact doing a dress rehearsal for a more deadly pandemic in the future if we are to engage in what I call some strategic foresight? So what is this important theme of resilience? We talk about crisis management, and we're looking at tools and strategies, adaptation to new environments and circumstances that we heard from my predecessor. But I want to marry crisis management with responsible tourism, but also responsible leadership, because I am suggesting that managing a crisis involves complex leadership. It's a complex leadership issue that requires unique leadership skills. Have those of our people in the region at the apex of decision-making, who walk the corridors of decision-making, display that responsible leadership, whereby a crisis requires a sensitive environment, and in some cases can be hostile. And leaders invariably have to make multifaceted and far-reaching decisions with limited or changing information. So we have to marry responsible tourism, responsible development with responsible leadership. It's an inescapable reality. And therefore, when we talk about strategies of resilience, we have to look at coordination. That's where responsible leadership is as well. Novel management techniques, integrated networks, recognizing risks and responsibilities, but also timely and scalable intervention. So how do we prepare for the next pandemic? I think we have to pay some great attention to linking disaster, tourism, and health. COVID-19, we're saying, is a case study in limited accessibility, in overburdened health systems, in inadequate access to healthcare, in information, disinformation, and misinformation. So we have to engage a disaster reduction strategy, disaster risk reduction strategy that requires integration and multi-sectoral collaboration. In comes the case of Grenada, the Spice Isle of the Caribbean, where Grenada has shown some level of responsible leadership, a well-balanced, organized task force with the necessary skill set to oversee what was happening then, serious protocols taking into account the illness and acknowledging the difficulties on the part of government. You having an experienced team, but very importantly, the political will and commitment to coordinate and make the resources available. So leadership was important. The well-balanced, organized task force was important. The learning curve was important from last year up to this particular period. The partnerships were important, but we are also saying the decision by the authorities in the context of safety and mitigation to listen to the science and be guided by the science, as well as collaboration with the regional health institutions. No secret there. So we're talking about disaster risk reduction, the mitigation of further harm after illness or injury, and that is paramount. But we're also talking about that nexus between healthcare, tourism, and disaster reduction that have to, and these have to be closely connected. When we talk about disaster, we're talking about a situation that requires external support. When we talk about disaster risk, we're talking about the potential for adverse outcomes based on the disaster, where we can see casualties, infrastructure damage, livelihood interruption, and of course, the disruption of day-to-day activities. So how do we frame a response to COVID-19? I am suggesting, I'm submitting there that we need a disaster risk reduction approach that tackles the root causes of disasters and disaster risk. After all, COVID-19 can be placed in the realm of disasters, especially if you look at the security issue. So we talk about vulnerabilities that intersect with hazards. We talk about floods, earthquakes, for example. We're talking about disasters emerging from choices to create and allow vulnerabilities. Can we separate COVID-19 and other disasters and health security and the development agenda of the region in terms of a service industry led by tourism without looking at the inequity of wealth, without looking at the discrimination against populations within a country or region, without looking at the lack of provision of education, without looking at marginalization, at limited accessibility, all what you call part of the determinants of health and the determinants of economic well-being. So a resilience-based framework for meaningful transformation must be engaged with technological innovation, domestic travel in terms of local and regional belongingness? Why can't we develop our domestic travel or regional travel industry, taking into account all of the activities and the decisions that have to be made? What about the consumer and employee confidence that we need to engender? What about, we spoke about sustainable tourism, but what also about the well-being of society? The speakers before me spoke about the fact that if tourism is not doing what it needs to do in terms of elevating the lives of individuals and elevating the livelihoods of individuals, then we should at least reset the button on it. So we need to balance economic growth with the welfare of the society, because we know what that can lead to if we do not. What about the meaningful connections we need to encourage? And we spoke about the ecological balance, in terms of life, health, environment. All of that must now be the new focus. So let's reset the Eastern Caribbean tourism button. So we want to restart, we want to reorganize, but we want to assimilate the tourism industry according to the latest standards and rules. And therefore, we have to look at opportunities for the new dispensation to include climate change mitigation, although I want to say environmental change mitigation, because I believe that climate change is but a subset of the larger universal set of environmental change. And then we have to talk about our local communities and the whole of society well-being. So tourism has had its defining moments. Local communities as centers of transformation would be a defining moment. Community-centered tourism, a community-centered tourism framework to fit the interests and aspirations of local communities. Let's not leave these out. What about a deeper understanding of remote communities' challenges? Can tourism be reset in terms of looking at that, taking that into consideration? What about the consideration of the new phenomenon now referred to as proximity tourism based on local thought and local acting perspectives? And what about reimagining health and tourism integration at this point in time? And this is how I see it. So under tourism, we can create new business models. Yes, we spoke about that. We can talk about governments, we can talk about market stakeholders, local communities for resilience and sustainability. That's good. But look on the other side in terms of health. Here's an opportunity, as some speakers said before, to integrate agriculture, nutrition security, critical, and health. But very importantly, CSOs, civil society organizations, the non-governmental community being contacted in terms of policy and planning networks, being integrated into the policy and planning networks. And of course, the good old private public sector synergies would be important as we try to alleviate the trust deficit that each face in terms of each other, and we try to alleviate the suspicions that basically are the ghosts that have continued to walk around the private and sector integration, private and public sector integration. And what about the need for flexible thinking? Flexible thinking. So we're talking about artificial intelligence. Can we bring that in? What about the Internet of Things? Technologies related to location, navigation, and so on. But flexible thinking for integration of health as well, in terms of social networking, promoting the rural sector, sourcing more resources locally. And we can go on and on. And we have spoken about the tourism and health program. That is already there in terms of what CARPHA has done. So I want to talk about all hands on deck. There's no room for complacency. So it cannot be business as usual. Investment now is critical. Fundamental social change is demanded. Our governance structures must change, and that is critical. Integration is basically the ingredient that we need. Building relationships, integrated multidisciplinary health, examining core benefits for tourism and the other entities and stakeholders involved, and the good old interprofessional collaboration cannot be left out because, as we said, all brains and all hands on deck. I thank you.
Well, Dr. Graves, if I have to come up with 2 words to describe that presentation, I would say it was passionate, and provocative. And I quite appreciated the linkage that you made between health and tourism. I keep saying that everything is connected, and COVID-19 has, in my view, done something that has not been done before, and that is to elevate in the consciousness of destinations and citizens in destinations, linkage between health and tourism. You provided us with the disaster lens, which I personally consider to be quite useful as a lens of analysis for the task that we are setting ourselves. Very critically, you mentioned the trust deficit. And I don't think at any time I have seen the trust deficit as alarming as I have seen it over this past year, since the COVID crisis has been with us. And it's been particularly so in St. Lucia, but St. Lucia has not been unique in that respect. So thank you very, very much for those words. I think you've given us a considerable lot that we can work with, not just in the context of this discussion, but in the context of the evolution of the project that we are speaking in the context of. I want to recognize the presence in our audience of the Honorable Ernest Dilher, who is the Shadow Minister for Tourism in the St. Lucia Labour Party in St. Lucia, as well as Sylvester Crozel, who is the advisor on sustainable tourism to Minister Philip Pierre, who is the leader of the opposition. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. So we're doing fairly well with time, but we could do a little better. So we now go to Sally Yozel, and Sally and I have become friends since she joined the meeting today. Sally will speak to us on the risks that are involved in scaling up tourism. And as we've noted, these risks are not just health related, but they're also environmental. And there's a link between the health of the environment and human health, of course. For this reason, we are delighted to have Sally with us. Sally is the Director of Environmental Security Program at the Stinson Center. She will present on the findings of the work of that center from the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index, which is developed by the center. Sally, welcome. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to my new friend Cletus for that kind introduction, and thank you to David Barron and the ICCF group, as well as the OECS, for hosting this really important discussion on strengthening the tourism sector. If we could bring up my slides, that would be great. As we heard from Carolyn and Maria, the tourism sector is critical for the economic security of the Caribbean nations. However, let me just stop for a minute. Can we bring up my slides, please?
Yep, I'm on it. One moment.
Okay, thanks, Olivia. I'll keep going. However, climate change has poses a substantial threat to the long-term sustainability of the tourism sector. And the Eastern Caribbean nation is vulnerable to a host of climate hazards, including intensifying hurricanes, extreme heat, sea level rise, drought and flooding. And these hazards from climate change also have severe knock-on effects for coastal ecosystems and the communities which are essential to tourism and their related industries. I mean, think about Hurricane Irma with its 185-mile-an-hour winds that almost wiped Barbuda off the map in 2017, or the Christmas Eve trough in 2013 that caused severe flooding all across St. Lucia and devastated infrastructure. In addition to adapting to climate change, we also need to understand the unintended consequences that tourism can have on nature itself. I mean, tourists are drawn to the beautiful beaches, the waters and the mountains, and the natural places all across the Eastern Caribbean. And nature plays an important role in protecting these coastal communities from climate risks, while also providing economic and food security. Ecosystems like corals and mangroves are key selling points for the industry, but they also protect coastal areas from flooding and can reduce the punch from the big storm. Next slide, please. So to build a sustainable tourism industry, we really need to understand all of the interconnected risks in order to know how best to invest in the people, the infrastructure, and the natural environment, while also taking into account the growing climate impacts. So to better understand these impacts in coastal areas, the Stimson Center developed CORVI, the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index. CORVI is a decision support tool which really produces a holistic climate risk assessment for coastal cities. This includes the impact of climate change on vulnerable sectors, ecosystem services, and coastal city inhabitants. And we decided to focus on coastal cities because cities are at the forefront of climate change and also are the hub of island nations' blue economies. So how does it work? The CORVI process collects empirical data and also surveys experts across governments, academia, civil society, and the private sector. And then we build this holistic risk picture. So as you can see in the CORVI wheel, we look at financial, political, and ecological risks. And under these sectors, we then focus on 10 risk categories, which then include close to 100 separate different indicators. Now that's a lot of information, but with this information, we're then able to compare the diverse range of risks and help government officials really pinpoint and prioritize actions to reduce climate risk and safeguard the future investments. Next slide, please. So our initial CORVI projects were piloted in Castries, St. Lucia, and Kingston, Jamaica. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the results we found in Castries. So after discussions with local experts, we expanded our geography of the assessment beyond the city limits to also include Gros Islet, a tourism hotspot that's just north of the city. And the CORVI assessment showed that for Castries, climate risks are driven by economic and environmental vulnerability. As we heard earlier from Carolyn, tourism is a critical industry for Castries, directly employing about 40% of its population, but that figure rises to approximately 70% when you include the secondary sectors and the informal economy. However, this industry is under threat from a growing number of climate hazards, like sea level rise or hurricanes, and the growing number of extreme heat events. And these risks have also been compounded by land-based stressors. Unregulated construction in the watershed has affected the fresh water supply that's so important to the hotels and other tourism industries. Yet tourism has also had unforeseen negative consequences. Pollution from a lack of effective waste management has harmed healthy coastal ecosystems, including coral reefs, which are so important to the tourism. Other relevant findings highlighted critical climate infrastructure risks, including an overdependence on imported oil, energy infrastructure located in the flood zone, extensive coastal development, which has negatively impacted ecosystems, and also poor road conditions. We also find high youth unemployment. And all of these issues are really vital to a thriving tourism industry. So based on these findings, we made several recommendations, including the need to promote economic diversification, such as light manufacturing, agricultural crops, finance, and even new tourism opportunities away from the coast. And this includes improving training and reskilling the labor force. We recommended ensuring new tourism projects and ensuring that the waste they generate do not damage St. Lucia's ecosystems. This is important for building a sustainable blue tourism economy for many years to come. We also suggested build resilience across key infrastructure, such as energy facilities, increase renewable energy, improve the roads, and the cruise ship terminal, which are both vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal erosion and flooding. So after the assessment was published, the findings have been a key resource in efforts to unlock additional climate investment in St. Lucia. For example, the World Economic Forum and the OECD, in collaboration with the government of St. Lucia, have developed the Country Financing Roadmap Initiative, which integrated many of the Corby findings into their own work on climate impacts, including the need for economic diversification, renewable energy promotion, and the importance of ecosystem health. So, after the successful assessments in Castries and Kingston, we are now working with partners to conduct 5 additional city assessments in East Africa and Asia, and we're also planning to announce a new Corby project soon in the Eastern Caribbean region. So to finish, I just want to reiterate the value of Corby. As climate hazards continue to increase and final resources remain tight, Corby provides a detailed, granular assessment on the climate vulnerabilities facing coastal cities. And this type of information can really help governments prioritize adaptation actions and gain access to investment needed to build resilience in coastal cities. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you so much for your efficient management of time. I quite like this project. I wish there was more time to learn more about it. But I think for countries like ours that are on the front line of climate change, many of us in the Caribbean in particular, we need to really begin to factor climate change impacts in our development policies, and in particular, the tourism sector, as many of our tourism plans is essentially at risk. So thank you very, very much for that. Our next presenter will be Colin Piper. Colin is with the, he will present to us on the Dominica's Safe in Nature policy, which that country is promoting, and the various policy considerations that have gone into its development. As you know, Dominica has a tagline as the nature isle of the Caribbean, and I have to say, St. Lucia aside, that Dominica has really walked the talk on that policy. So Colin, we're happy to have you with us, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay and see my presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
We are tight on time, so please
Okay.
bear us in mind. Okay, thanks.
Alrighty. So morning to everyone, and certainly greetings from Dominica, the nature island of the Caribbean. As Cletus mentioned, I'm Colin Piper, CEO and Director of Tourism for the Discover Dominica Authority. And certainly thanks to the ICCF group, the organizers, for putting on this event, and many thanks for the invitation to be part of such an esteemed panel and share one aspect of Dominica's experience. My contribution, as mentioned, to the discussion on strengthening the sustainable tourism sector will be to present on Dominica's Safe in Nature program.
Colin, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for one moment just because we don't actually see the presentation.
Okay, let me just make sure that in terms of sharing the screen, that is happening.
I'm happy to share on your behalf as well, if that's easier.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Sure. Just one moment. Can you see that?
Sure.
Perfect.
You can move on to the next slide. So to provide some context, we began discussions on the Safe in Nature program around July, August of 2020. This was 3 months after officially being on lockdown in March of 2020, but on the cusp of dialogue on reopening to nationals in the first instance, which happened in July 15th, and then to all other travelers, which happened on August 7th. At that time, we can report now that the tourism industry had experienced virtually a 99.9% reduction over the second quarter in terms of visitor arrivals. And our just direct loss through extrapolation was at about 20 million US, or 55 million EC, being forfeited in terms of direct visitor arrival expenditure. Also, tourism and health sectors were now working, I would say, more collaboratively than we had in the past as a result of protocols which needed to be established and under which to operate. And the thinking at that time was, how do we safely host guests with particular focus on limiting the importation of the COVID-19 virus and containing local spread, but allows tourism stakeholders to generate some income, coupled with how do we still give guests a pleasurable experience in the nature island where they can enjoy our hiking trails, waterfalls, and cultural immersion. Next slide. So as we look at some of the actors involved in this, certainly some were directly involved and others were playing a supporting role, including regional agencies like CARPHA and international health agencies like PAHO and WHO through their bodies of work. But locally, in the public sector, we have the Ministries of Health and the Ministry of Tourism, as well as other agencies like Immigration and Customs and Ports of Entry that had to be a part of the dialogue and part of the implementation. And from a private sector perspective, while the properties took the lead through their associations, we also had equally important was those who provided supporting and ancillary services like taxi drivers, tour guides, and especially those in the communities that offered a tourism-related activity. And we also had to look at the travelers as they were critical because you need to determine how the new travel experience would impact them, be it psychologically and certainly financially, because you have aspects of quarantine that have now come into play. And also looking at the local population, would they understand the need to open up the country again, to allow travelers back into the island, and with the inherent risks associated with that. Next slide, please. And so the Safe in Nature program, elements of that included a program that was geared at attracting visitors from our main source market, which unfortunately, were all classified as high risk. And so there were protocols that we had to put in place for that. The program tried to guarantee a managed experience through the first 5 to 7 days of the visitor's mandatory quarantine period upon arrival into Dominica. And we did that by establishing what we call the tourism bubble, within which a specific managed activities could take place while being separated from others. So you would maintain the protocols for that cohort or that individual. And so the managed experience is really the critical aspect of the Safe in Nature program from a traveler's perspective. Certainly the Safe in Nature program required that all service providers would be trained and that the program use certified tourism service providers. So the element of training or knowledge transfer features prominently in allowing the stakeholders to be a part of the solution. Requisite testing was also part of it, inclusive of a day 5 PCR swab to satisfy ourselves that the visitors were in fact COVID-free. Next slide, please. So when you look at the managed experience within Safe in Nature program, it is in fact the experiential part of for the traveler. It is where aspects of Dominica's sustainable tourism product would be showcased and experienced. The managed experience allows for both land-based and water-based pre-approved tours. So guests have the opportunity to visit our historic Fort Shirley, which is in the Cabritz National Park, or hike to the Boylan Lake, the world's second largest Boylan Lake, which traverses through the UNESCO World Heritage Mont Wapitor National Park, or to go scuba diving within the Soufriere Scottshead Marine Reserve. So in this way, we're utilizing the natural assets within national parks and protected areas to not only have the guest experience our sustainable aspects of our tourism plan, but to sustain the economic livelihoods of some of the stakeholders and service providers. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the benefits here, you can see the benefits of the Safe in Nature program. We've had upwards of 68 properties certified, and that includes resorts, hotels, Airbnbs, guest houses. We've had up to 3 land-based tour operators certified, 5 water sports operators certified. And since we began the program early in October 2020, we've had close to 1,400 guests that have hosted. And if you extrapolate that they're staying 7 nights, and you apply a rate, you can see that it has at least allowed some cash flow to the local stakeholders. Next slide, please. And so from a local awareness perspective, the logo, the seal, so to speak, Safe in Nature, is what is most visible and is provided where it is a decal on the certified taxis. It's used in its digital format on websites. It's used at front desk areas at some of the properties. Next slide, please. And from a country perspective, how we are certainly looking to benefit. We believe that this is a wonderful program. And so we've gone out to market, and you can see some of the elements of the communication plan, certainly utilizing social media, having done a press release, and working with travel agents and tour operators to discuss aspects of the Safe in Nature program. So these are obviously elements of the communication plan to promote the offering. And of course, to visit Dominica, the nature island of the Caribbean, which we believe is a perfect antidote to the stresses brought about by COVID-19. Also, stay tuned for information on our Work in Nature program, which is for remote workers to be launched soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was fascinating. Dominica always manages to come up with something innovative, and that is very apt. So thanks again for that presentation. So we're now down to our last speaker. And when I say last, I really mean by no means least, because Richard, as he's known as the Bard of VG here in Castries, is known for probing commentary, including on Facebook, but he's also been a very responsible commentator on national development issues, always trying to offer a balanced perspective. And so we are pleased to have Richard, with his rich background in accounting and economics and so on, to share with us his perspectives today. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cletus. And you can call that the Oracle of VG. But welcome, everybody. Okay, I think, Olivier, you've got my presentation. Flip that up, and I'll get right into it. The previous speakers have defined, what we mean by sustainable tourism, how governments in the OECS, the private sector, are addressing the issues of resilience and sustainability, and how, companies, hospitality companies, are embracing and coping with the numerous challenges that they now face, the significance it has on our society and environmental health, and how we identify and measure our environmental vulnerabilities. There we go. On my second slide, so I just say next, that's just a quotation or a couple of quotations from Sir Richard Attenborough. His recent shows have been really fascinating as to what's happening globally. So it's always a good guy to get a quote from. Next. Yeah, so we've heard from everybody, and I think, you know, we understand. I don't think anybody has a problem with the importance, the realities, the imperatives. So it's safe to assume we can all agree as to the importance and to the obligation of adopting and implementing national and regional strategies to protect our countries, our companies, our lives, and our livelihoods for the present and for the future generations. Major problem we face, though, is how are we going to finance these strategies? Our countries in the Eastern Caribbean are all, say, small island development states which share similar sustainable development difficulties. And these include small but growing populations, limited resources, remoteness, susceptibility to natural disasters, vulnerability to exogenous shocks, excessive dependence on international trade. I'm getting phone calls left, right, and center. And all kinds of other problems that really make it difficult for us to do the kinds of things that we know we have to do and would like to do, but are constrained by essentially the fragility of our environment and our finances. Our growth and development is also compromised by high communication, energy, and transportation costs, irregular international transport volumes, disproportionately expensive public administration and infrastructure due to our small size and little to no opportunity to create economies of scale. We have limited influence on global environmental agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, but suffer enormously from global abuses and practices which adversely affect our health, our economies, and our natural resources. So our financial capacity on the next slide. Our financial capacity in both the public and private sector is dependent on a number of revenue streams, and you see a number of them listed there. And I'm putting both into here because the revenue streams and the finance that comes to government is necessary for them to undertake the infrastructure and support to tourism. So it's not just money that's coming to the private sector here, it's money that's coming to the public sector, that's available to the public sector, and sometimes available when both get together. But in addition to our typical things, such as taxation from domestic and international, borrowings from multilateral financial institutions, other governments, friendly governments, local financial institutions, etc., grants from friendly governments and multilaterals, and to a lesser extent from global funds and NGOs, both in cash and in kind, foreign direct investment from private and commercial sectors, revenue user fees and tolls, both go to government and you know where you have things in the country, products in the country, projects that you can charge money for, and equity investments from the very owners, the private owners of the companies that are heavily involved in tourism. Those are all the different means of, and sources of finance, which have proven over time to be insufficient to finance both the services that governments are required to provide for its citizens, to health, education, security, social services, and other critical infrastructure, as well as the social and environmental investment to boost resilience and support sustainable guidelines. Many governments now have, problems obtaining new financing and get most of their money from existing security markets or borrowing on international markets, which is generally prohibitively expensive and would expose them to currency, and next slide, to currency and interest rate risk. Most of the borrowing is therefore restricted to loans from MFIs, friendly governments, and short-term refinancing to recycle maturing bonds or treasury bills. The revenue streams themselves have proven over time to be insufficient, as I said, with the existing and traditional sources of finance, there's a problem in trying to identify what we can access in order to make a difference, particularly given through a time like this. The COVID pandemic has exposed our islands, most of which are dependent on tourism, to the fragility of its revenue sources, its lack of reserves and contingency funds, and its deficient investment in health, education, and eco-infrastructure. This is the government's. What was already an inadequate fiscal space for exogenous shocks has now become a glaring gap, exacerbated by the urgent need for social and health recovery expenditure. And we're not even out of the woods as yet. The private sector is not in much better shape. There's an insufficient pool of domestic savings, scarce domestic investment in the productive sectors, such as manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism, and overdependence on short-term borrowing at unsustainable rates, resulting in low returns, low productivity, and high unemployment. The hospitality industry has become the biggest employer and generator of foreign exchange, but the returns for foreign-owned and domestic hotel companies are still marginal due to high operating costs and average daily rates that are constrained by regional competition and high airlift costs. Most hotel companies are very highly leveraged, and so therefore they have difficulties servicing their bank borrowings. Next slide. Neither the public nor the private sectors has sufficient fiscal space to finance continuing revenue losses, and we've really seen those losses in the last year from the pandemic, or to reduce the high levels of unemployment and undertake the new investment required to strengthen and ensure a sustainable and resilient tourism sector. Next slide. So, sorry, you can stay here. So what has to change? Economists are calling for a lessening of our dependence on tourism and for economies to pivot, but few have been able to suggest viable alternatives to diversify the economy in the short term. Some islands, such as Dominica, have been able to fare better than others because of government revenues from other sources that have been repurposed to deal with critical health expenditure and support for social and economic resilience, and also to the tourism sector. If we are to make and continue the investments we need to strengthen and ensure sustainability in all sectors, not just tourism, we'd have to vigorously pursue all of the options that are realistically available to develop and finance our strategies. These would include, and you can change the slide, identify, measure, and cost, and Sally spoke to those, what resilience and sustainability for the industry and the economy will require that have already been done, such as the work done by Corvi. Dedicate some revenue streams, such as income from citizenship by investment schemes, to build strong health systems, social protection mechanisms, and disaster risk management capacities, as well as the greening of buildings and housing to be more resilient while investing in education and retraining. Since 2014, Dominica's CBI program has been able to improve dramatically the fiscal space that was necessary to recover, and it exemplifies to devise a sustainable economic plan for that country. And a recent report by PwC has indicated exactly how significant that has been. And of course, Dominica has some robust CBI funding. In St. Lucia, last year, we raised about $28 million, which went to government from the CBI. And that's forecast to provide another $45 million in 2021. And that doesn't even include the money that government will get from the sale of bonds. The big problem, though, is how long is that going to last? Because we've already seen the pressure we got from the EU on our offshore sector, and now we begin to get pressure on our CBI programs because they have some concerns there. We need to continue to access all available concessionary funding from MFIs, as there is an indication that there is going to be a lot more money available, particularly for health and social support. But we need to allow private sector hospitality companies to access some of these new and additional revenue streams and grants so that the companies can refinance debt and pandemic losses and make the investments in alternative energy and rehabilitation and restoration of nature areas to protect the vital ecosystems. We need to develop private and public partnerships, because it's the only way we're really going to be able to access some of these funds is if we're working together. There's a tendency to say they want the government and the private sector as partners, and we're just no money available unless we both go to the table together. So if we're able to do that, we can access funds that are available from international public and private trust funds, such as the US $10 million Bezos Climate Fund, which was announced in November last year. And already 16 environmental organizations have got $791 million from the fund for climate action. There are many green funds that we can access with well-designed products. Even Bloomberg has quite a few of those. We need to examine, and Carolyn mentioned it briefly, the possibility of green bonds for resilience and sustainable products. It's not easy because it means government is going to have to back the bonds. We're going to have to find buyers for the bonds. We're going to have to establish a rate. And then we're going to have to agree, because these bonds in essence are going to be public-private, as to how the money is used and ensure that it is going to be used in a sustainable way. But the buyers can be NISs and insurance companies and other people like that. We need to make new incentives granted to hospitality companies conditional on specific unmeasurable investments in alternative energies, conservation and management of protected areas. Too often, the incentives have been given tend to be tax incentives, but there's really no condition in respect of what the hotel has to be doing in some of those areas, which is critical. And we need to work proactively to improve sources of revenue and financial metrics to ensure that conservation plans should be tied to more realistic budgets, etc. So, for example, working with a national trust, using the available resources that we have, ensuring that we are pricing them properly so that can raise the money that is necessary for both the trust and for other organizations, so that in fact it doesn't become dependent on just government grants. Next slide.
Are you okay?
Yeah, that's what we. So, it's obvious that the current financial flows are inadequate to sustain, let alone to expand protected area networks. And according to the World Economic Forum, many of the most vulnerable developing countries may not be able to endure or recover from this pandemic in the absence of adequate development financial support. Robust multilateral cooperation and strong support of the international community are essential to enable the most vulnerable developing countries, such as his, to respond and recover. So you can see the final comment with a nice clip by our friend. And this is essentially where we are. We know what it's cost. We know we have to do it. But the problem is we have priorities right now just dealing with the pandemic. And even if we get over that, problems, putting our heads together to be able to access the finance and then use it efficiently, effectively for what we're talking about today. Last slide, and I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That entire theme of the financing of sustainable development or sustainable tourism is one that can command an entire panel discussion and indeed an entire set of teaching modules. And it's just unfortunate that we didn't have enough time to delve deeper into the mechanics of the financing options that you proposed. But unfortunately, we were supposed to have had a robust question and answer session of about 20, 25 minutes, but that was not possible. And in a sense, I'm not too disheartened that we were not able to have this exchange, because I think I cannot think of anything that was presented that I would want left out. I think everything that was presented is very relevant. And helps to give, to complete the picture, the prism for which this project is seeking to drive, the prism of nature-based tourism, the prism of heritage tourism, sustainable tourism, etc., however you wish to define it. We've had a rich body of ideas that have been put forward. In the time that's available, I can't do an honest summary, and I won't attempt to do that, except to say, Richard, the point at which you close is perhaps the most appropriate. We have known for some time what we need to do. We have known for some time what the challenges are, but we have not done what has been necessary, and we have not been consistent enough. We have not been open enough. We have not been engaging enough. And when I say we, to the point that you made about a private partnership on tourism, on sustainable tourism. I believe personally that this is where we need to go. We need to define the parameters of what that partnership will be. And it cannot be just private and public. It must be private, public in its full sense, public involving the public, as well as the public sector, as it is currently defined, and the private sector. So going forward through this project, we have the foundation for us to do a deeper dive into these issues, and hopefully at some point in the midterm of this project and the evaluation, we might come back together with this panel to see how the project has evolved and how it has embraced some of the issues that have been raised in this discussion. I want to close with my thanks on behalf of all of you, and my thanks to all of you, including those that have joined us via YouTube and the internet. Thank you for your participation in this session. The recording will be posted, and the links for that will be, I hope, communicated to all ministries of tourism and other actors in the Caribbean, in the participating countries in particular. So thank you very much once again, and I turn the floor back over to Olivia and to David.